Hello everybody, welcome back to another AP Biology video. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of AP Biology topic 5.3 with a special focus on pedigrees. Pedigrees pop up on the AP exam from time to time in order to show inheritance patterns. On the AP exam, you will be expected to be able to analyze 4 basic pedigree charts that we're going to review in this slide presentation. So, without any further explanation, let's get into it. First off, what is a pedigree? So a pedigree you can think of like a family tree, only instead of just tracking people, we're tracking traits or disorders. In this case, we are going to use specific signals to designate different characteristics about our family members. Starting off, we're going to use squares to represent our male individuals and circles to represent our female individuals. When two individuals get married, we add a marriage line between them. This is going to be just a simple horizontal line connecting those two shapes. From there, we can show their offspring that are produced using a branching line. So here we can see that they have 2 children, and those children are siblings. Notice how they branch off of the parents' line. So from there, we can determine other things like who has the characteristic in question. If we shade over a shape, that means that that individual is affected. So in this simple pedigree chart, we have an affected son and an affected mother. If we don't shade in a shape, that means that that individual is unaffected or they don't display the trait that we're looking for. Now, for cases where traits are carried on recessive alleles, that may mean that an individual is a carrier, and that will be something for you guys to figure out. Think of these like puzzles. Another piece that you may see when you come across pedigree charts are our generational numbers. So each row in a pedigree chart is going to have a specific number associated with it, and that tells you which generation the individuals are a part of. We'll keep all of generation 1 in one row and all of generation 2 in another row. One of the things that I didn't include in this figure that you should see on the AP exam are numbers to identify the birth order of individuals within that generation. This also helps us tell individuals apart when we start to get into more complex pedigree charts. So before we jump into the analysis of specific pedigrees, let's take a moment to review the differences between our chromosomes. So when we have traits that are tracked over many generations, they will appear in specific ways depending on the inheritance pattern. And the inheritance patterns that we're going to be looking at can either be dominant, which means that they're carried on the dominant allele, recessive, which means that they're carried on the recessive allele, but they may also be either carried on our autosomes or on our sex chromosomes. Remember that our autosomes are those chromosomes that carry our non-sexually related characteristics, and our sex chromosomes are those that carry our sexual related characteristics. So chromosomes in humans 1 through 22, those are our autosomes, and our 23rd pair are our sex chromosomes. When we look at sex-related characteristics, oftentimes we also have to consider that females have an X and an X, and males are going to have an X and a Y in humans. And so this oftentimes presents us with unique characteristics of their pedigree charts that help us to distinguish them from autosomally inherited characteristics. So let's start us off with our first pedigree chart. So this pedigree chart is going to be showing a autosomal dominant characteristic. A good key to working through these problems is just to pick a set of parents and a set of offspring and see if you can identify what potential genotypes they have in order to present with these phenotypes. A couple of things to keep in mind that may make this easier is, so starting off, if both male and female parents are affected, so they have the characteristic, but they produce unaffected offspring, that means that our trait has to be autosomal dominant. This shows that both of our parents are heterozygous for this particular gene, and they're able to produce, at least in a 25% expected ratio, a homozygous recessive offspring. Another thing to note is that if both of our parents are unaffected, that means that their offspring also need to be unaffected. If both of our parents are unaffected, that means that they're homozygous recessive. They can only produce homozygous recessive offspring, unless someone has some explaining to do. Finally, if we have an affected individual, they need to have at least one affected parent. So in order for them to inherit that dominant character, they have to have got it from at least one of their parents who will also display that dominant character. So these are 3 items to keep in mind in order for us to identify an autosomal dominant inheritance pattern in a pedigree chart. Let's look at the opposite, an autosomal recessive pedigree. So in our autosomal recessive pedigrees, we have characteristics that are carried on the recessive allele, and so sometimes they may be masked, which is important to consider when we're trying to figure out where these traits are coming from. One of the things that we can identify is that if we have 2 parents and they are both unaffected, but they produce an affected offspring, then our trait must be autosomal recessive. So in this case, both of our parents are once again heterozygous, and they are able to produce a homozygous recessive offspring who displays this recessive characteristic, but it's masked by that dominant character in the parental generation. Another thing that we can look for is that if both parents are affected, their offspring also need to be affected. Now, I didn't include an example of this characteristic in this particular pedigree chart, but if you think about it, if both of our parents are homozygous recessive, they can only produce homozygous recessive offspring. So our autosomal characteristics are oftentimes the easier of the two because they're going to follow the same pattern from generation to generation, and they're not going to differ based on the sex of our parent. So we get a little bit more complicated as we get into our sex-linked traits. So with an X-linked dominant trait, this is a trait that is carried on the X chromosome, and in the dominant allele, we have a couple of new rules that we need to consider. The fact that our mother is going to pass on an X to either her male or female offspring, and that our father will pass on his X to his daughters, but not his sons, because the sons have to inherit the Y from dad. So here are a couple of things that we can be on the lookout for in order to identify an X-linked dominant trait. First, if a male is affected, his mother and his daughters must also be affected. He has to get that affected X from mom because he's not inheriting it from dad, And he has to pass on that affected X to his daughters because they're not going to get a Y chromosome. Another thing that we can look for is that if we have an unaffected female, she cannot have affected sons or an affected father. So she is going to inherit an X from both dad and mom, and she's going to pass on that X to her son and her daughter. And so if she's unaffected, she cannot produce an affected offspring. And finally, the last note is not something that I can show in this particular pedigree, but it does tend to be that we have more common examples of X-linked dominant traits in females than males, but that is just a tendency. That is not always the case, not a hard and fast rule. The last pedigree that we're going to look at is our X-linked recessive characters, which can be masked from one generation to the next, just like our autosomal recessive characteristics. So a couple of the things that we want to keep an eye out for in order for us to help determine if this is an X-linked recessive characteristic is that if we have an affected female, her father and her sons must also be affected because she's going to pass on that recessive X to her sons, and she is going to have inherited that recessive X from her father. And in this case, she also has to get a recessive X from her mother, but her mother is a carrier in this case, so her mother doesn't display the trait. Another thing that we can look out for is that if we have an unaffected female, she may have affected sons if her father is affected. So in this case, our unaffected female is the carrier, and she's going to pass on, at least with a 50% chance, that affected X to her male offspring. Now, another thing that we can't display in an X-linked recessive pedigree chart is the fact that they tend to be more common in males, but just like the previous, not a hard and fast rule. So hopefully, with this all together and all of these ways that we can help to identify these pedigree charts, this helps us to be able to decipher what the inheritance pattern is in a given pedigree chart. The best thing to do for all of these problems is to practice. That is really the only way. Get down in there, identify some characteristics, make some mistakes, and have fun with it. I'll catch you guys in the next video.